Arden Halls had been in worse situations. He'd survived meteor storms, engine failures in the dead of space, and once, a gunfight over a shipment of illegal cryofluid. But trudging through the icy wilderness of an uncharted moon, with no signal from his emergency beacon and only a steadily draining heat pack in his survival suit, he was beginning to wonder if his luck had finally run out. The glacier was impossible to miss. It loomed over the rocky expanse like a jagged, silver-blue monolith, catching the faint light of the moon's twin suns. Arden had stumbled into its shadow while following a barely there trail through the frozen landscape. As he drew closer, something peculiar caught his eye, a soft glow, pulsing faintly from deep within the ice. At first, he thought it might be some kind of natural phenomenon, like the luminous algae he'd seen on Waterworlds, but this was different. The light was too steady, too deliberate. Curiosity won out over caution. He clambered over the slick, uneven terrain, boots crunching on frost-covered stones, until he reached the base of the glacier. There, beneath a thick sheet of ice, was a shape. Arden squinted, his breath misting inside his helmet's visor. The figure was massive, easily twice his height, and winged. He leaned closer, placing a gloved hand against the ice. The cold bit through the suit's insulation, but he barely noticed. It wasn't just some ancient fossil or frozen animal. The being inside had scales that gleamed like polished metal and a face that looked almost human. Is it alive? The words tumbled out before he could stop himself. There was no answer, of course, only the low moan of the wind. But the longer he stared, the more certain he became. The position of the wings, folded protectively over the figure's body, the slight tilt of the head, everything about it suggested it wasn't some long-dead creature. It was waiting. As if to confirm his thought, a faint wave of warmth seeped through the ice beneath his hand. Arden yanked it back, startled, but the heat didn't stop. The glow inside the ice brightened, the rhythmic pulse speeding up like a quickening heartbeat. He stepped back, unsure if he should run or stay. Then came the crack. A thin, hairline fracture streaked across the icy surface. Arden's eyes widened as the crack spread, spidering out until the entire wall of ice in front of him shattered in an explosion of mist and shards. When the cloud cleared, the figure was there, free from her icy prison. Her wings, enormous and silver blue like her scales, unfurled with a soft hiss. Arden's gaze traveled up to her face, alien, yet undeniably intelligent, with gleaming, slit-pupiled eyes that locked onto his. She took a step forward and collapsed, her legs buckling under her. Without thinking, Arden rushed forward, catching her before she hit the ground. Her body was freezing, but a strange energy seemed to radiate from her skin. As he held her, her eyes opened just a sliver. Her voice was faint, more like a whisper that bypassed his ears and settled in his mind. "Thank you," she said, and the words resonated inside him, warm and unfamiliar. Arden's heart hammered. He didn't know what he had just done or what he had unleashed. But as he stared at the being in his arms, he knew one thing for certain: his life was no longer his own. Lyria was still weak as Arden carried her back to his makeshift camp, little more than a cluster of emergency supply crates and a sputtering portable heater. The sudden liberation from the ice had left her nearly comatose, but she stirred occasionally, murmuring words in a language Arden didn't understand. Once, her tail twitched, scraping against the cold metal floor of the camp's tiny shelter pod. Arden ignored the sound, his mind too preoccupied to care about the faint scratch marks it left behind. When she finally opened her eyes again, her gaze found him instantly. She didn't speak aloud. Instead, a voice, calm and resonant, echoed directly in his thoughts. "You have my thanks, stranger." Arden flinched, nearly knocking over a canister of water. "You can speak?" Her lips didn't move. Our kind of ways of sharing thought beyond words. We call it the tongue of embers. It's a connection of minds, not just sound. Arden stared at her. Her wings, though drooping, shimmered faintly in the light of the heater. Her silver-blue scales reflected like molten metal. She was utterly alien, yet something in her presence felt ancient and oddly familiar. "What are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated. "My name is Lyria. I am one of the Dragonkin." Dragonkin? Arden frowned. Never heard of them. You wouldn't have. She shifted slightly, folding her wings closer to her body. We were once known throughout the stars beings born of fire and flame, creators and protectors. But that was long ago, before the Great Silence. Before. We were hunted. Hunted? Arden echoed. His instinctive wariness sharpened. By who? Lyria's slit-pupiled eyes flicked to him, and for a moment he felt the weight of millennia in her gaze. There are forces in this galaxy that fear power. Those who wield it draw attention, often the wrong kind. My people were purged. One by one, our kind were destroyed, betrayed by allies who grew jealous, fearful, or simply cruel. The last of us vanished centuries ago. Until now. Arden let her words hang in the air, the small shelter pod seeming suddenly too close, too suffocating. He glanced outside, at the barren wasteland of ice and rock. Why here? Why were you frozen out there? Lyria shifted again, wincing slightly. A choice made in desperation. When it became clear I could not escape my pursuers, I used my final strength to encase myself in the ice, hiding my presence. It was meant to be temporary. Just long enough to let the danger pass. But something went wrong. I don't know how long I've been here, centuries, perhaps longer. Centuries. Arden's voice trailed off. And the people who were after you? Gone, perhaps. Or changed. But the galaxy has never been safe for my kind. She turned her gaze back to him, her voice pressing softly against his thoughts. I owe you my life, but by freeing me, you may have placed yourself in danger as well. Arden stiffened. What kind of danger? There are always those who would hunt us, Lyria said, her tone heavy. Not just for what we are, but for what we carry. The flame within us, the essence of our power, it is sought after by those who would turn it into weapons. They have hunted my kind since the dawn of our age, and if word spreads that one of us lives, they will come again. This time, they may target not only me, but anyone who stands in their way. Arden swallowed hard. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't intended to stumble into an ancient conflict or become the rescuer of an endangered species. He was just a cargo pilot with a busted ship. Yet as Lyria spoke, he could feel her fear, her determination, and the burden of her survival. Why are you telling me this? He asked after a long pause. Because, Lyria replied, if you leave now, you might have a chance to return to your life. But if you choose to help me, I must warn you there is no easy path ahead. Arden looked at her, studying the shimmering scales, the exhausted yet regal posture. He thought about the desolate moan, the lack of any other life here, and the way her voice had reached into his mind like a long-lost melody. A part of him wanted to walk away, to let her fend for herself. But another part, buried deep, whispered that her story wasn't over. And that, perhaps, his wasn't either. I'm not going anywhere yet, he said finally. Not until I figure out what I've gotten myself into. For the first time since he'd met her, Lyria's expression softened. Then I will tell you what I know. But you must understand, the galaxy is far larger and more dangerous than you've ever imagined. Even in the deep freeze of space, danger found a way to burn hot. Arden had barely coaxed his freighter into a shaky orbit above the frozen moon when Lyria's warning proved true. The ship's long-dormant sensors suddenly flared, picking up a sleek, angular vessel dropping out of hyperspace. Its hull gleamed black as obsidian, streaked with blood-red markings. To Arden's eyes, it looked more like a predator than a ship. Lyria, still recovering in the freighter's cramped living quarters, immediately sensed the approaching menace. She sat up with a sharp, serpentine motion, her tail flicking against the bulkhead. They've found me. Who's they? Arden asked, trying to keep the rising panic out of his voice. He'd already begun a rapid systems check, praying his patchwork repairs would hold. Mercenaries, Lyria said, her voice low and tight. No doubt hired by the same shadowed powers who wiped out my kind. They'll stop at nothing to take me and the crystal within me. Arden turned to her, frowning. You mentioned that crystal before. What is it, exactly? She placed a hand over her chest, where a faint, flickering light pulsed beneath her scales. The core flame. It's what makes the dragonkin what we are. A source of immense energy, a connection to the primordial fires of creation. To those who know how to wield it, it's more than power, it's life, knowledge, and the ability to shape the very fabric of the universe. That's why they hunt me. If they extract it. Her eyes darkened. They'll forge a weapon unlike any the galaxy has ever seen. Arden didn't need any more convincing. Whatever the core flame was, it sounded like trouble he didn't want to get tangled up in. Unfortunately, the approaching ship didn't seem inclined to give him a choice. The freighter's sensor alarms blared again, targeting systems locking on. Hold on, Arden said, throwing himself into the pilot's seat. His fingers danced over the controls. We're not sticking around to see what they've got. The freighter's engines roared as he punched the throttle. The ship jolted, shaking off the thin layer of frost that had accumulated while it was grounded. With a guttural whine, the vessel surged forward, leaving the frozen moon behind. But the mercenary ship was already closing the distance, its engines clearly faster and more advanced. Can you do something? Arden yelled back at Lyria. I don't know, light him on fire or something? Her expression was grim. I can barely hold my strength right now. If I channel the flame before I've fully recovered, I could burn myself out. Great, Arden muttered. Guess I'll have to improvise. The mercenary ship fired a warning shot, a beam of brilliant crimson that lanced past the freighter, close enough to make the hull groan. Arden gritted his teeth and slammed the ship into a spiraling maneuver, diving toward a nearby asteroid field. The freighter groaned in protest, but the rock formations offered the only cover for light years. The chase became a deadly game of hide-and-seek. Arden's freighter weaved between massive, tumbling chunks of ice and stone. The mercenaries, relentless and surgically precise, followed him through every twist and turn. Their weapons carved through smaller asteroids, sending fragments hurtling in all directions. Arden relied on instinct, darting through narrow passages that would have shredded a less experienced pilot. Inside the ship, Lyria remained seated, her wings tucked tightly against her body. Her breathing was slow and measured, but her eyes burned with a restrained fury. Arden didn't know if it was directed at the mercenaries or herself, but it made her seem even more otherworldly, as if a storm raged just beneath her scales. Is this how it always is? Arden shouted over the sound of blaring alarms and the groaning hull. No, she replied softly, her voice somehow cutting through the chaos. Sometimes it's worse. He didn't have time to reply. The mercenaries had anticipated his next move. A barrage of plasma bolts cut off his escape route, forcing him to pull the freighter into a steep climb. The ship shuddered violently, warning lights flashing across the console. They couldn't take many more hits. As they cleared the asteroid field, a bright star loomed ahead, its intense light painting the void with a faint golden glow. Arden's mind raced. He didn't have the firepower to fight back, and even Lyria admitted she wasn't ready to use her full strength. But maybe he didn't need to fight. Maybe he just needed to be clever. Lyria, he said, gripping the controls. That star up ahead, what happens if we get close? Her eyes narrowed. The radiation will be extreme. The solar flares are lethal at close range. Lethal for us? For any normal life form, she said slowly. But the core flame within me. It may shield me from some of the radiation. Good enough. Arden gritted his teeth. Hang on. I'm taking us in. Before she could protest, he turned the freighter directly toward the star. The mercenary ship hesitated just for a moment. It was enough. Arden pushed his engines to their limit, closing the distance to the star's corona. The ship's shielding groaned under the onslaught of radiation, the cockpit heating up despite the temperature controls. The mercenaries fired one last salvo, but their shots went wide. The star's blazing intensity scrambled their targeting systems. Arden's freighter disappeared into the star's searing light, the mercenary ship veering off to avoid being incinerated. Arden managed to keep the ship steady long enough to slingshot around the star and escape into the cooler expanse of space on the other side. As soon as the sensors confirmed the mercenaries were no longer in pursuit, he finally eased off the throttle. The freighter groaned in relief as the engines powered down. He slumped back in his seat, exhaling deeply. "Well," he said after a moment, "guess they'll think twice before chasing us into a star." Lyria looked at him, her expression inscrutable. Then, slowly, a faint smile touched her lips. "Perhaps you're not as reckless as you seem." "Thanks," Arden replied. "I think." But he knew this wasn't over. The mercenaries had seen her, and if they reported back to whoever had hired them, others would come. He'd bought them time, but they still had no idea how far the hunt would go or what dangers lay ahead. The derelict temple emerged from the swirling golden mists like a mirage. Arden's freighter coasted gently into a low orbit, its battered hull glowing faintly from the intense radiation of the star they had barely escaped. Below them lay a massive structure, ancient and cracked, with soaring spires and sprawling courtyards all built around the jagged core of a small, flickering sun and artificial star that bathed the temple in a warm, amber glow. "This is it," Lyria whispered, staring at the sight from the viewport. For the first time since he'd freed her from the ice, she seemed genuinely awed. "This is the Pyrian Temple. My people's last refuge. And their tomb." Arden said nothing. He guided the ship down slowly, settling it onto a patch of clear ground just outside the main gates. The temple loomed over them, larger than it had appeared from the air, its towers disappearing into the thick, golden mist. As they disembarked, the air was heavy with heat, thick and still like the breath of some ancient beast. The only sound was the faint hum of the artificial sun overhead. Lyria moved toward the temple's entrance with purpose, her wings unfurling slightly. Arden followed, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched, but when he looked, the mist revealed nothing. Still, he kept his hand close to his sidearm, just in case. "This place doesn't look exactly welcoming," Arden said, trying to keep his voice light. "What are we supposed to find here?" "Knowledge," Lyria replied. "This temple was a place of learning, of power. The dragonkin who once dwelled here left behind their writings, their wisdom. And, I hope, the strength we'll need to stop those who hunt us." She led him through the massive gates into a cavernous hall lined with towering columns. Strange symbols glowed faintly on the walls, shifting as they walked past. The air here was hotter, tinged with a metallic taste that clung to Arden's tongue. Lyria seemed to know exactly where to go, her pace quickening as they moved deeper into the temple. Finally, they arrived at a central chamber, a vast dome with a floor inlaid with intricate patterns of glowing amber. At the center stood a pedestal, upon which rested a crystalline structure that pulsed with a light similar to the one in Lyria's chest. "This is the Pyrian core," Lyria said, her voice reverent. "The anchor for the temple's power. It will allow me to fully access the flame once more. But—" She turned to Arden, her expression shadowed by concern. "There's a risk." "Why am I not surprised?" Arden muttered. He folded his arms, waiting for her to continue. "I've been weakened by my long entombment. To take in the Pyrian core's energy will restore my strength, but it could also change me. It may awaken parts of the flame I cannot control." Her gaze settled on him, steady and serious. "If that happens, you'll need to act. To stop me. Do you understand?" Arden hesitated. "I don't have any fancy powers or ancient knowledge, Lyria. What am I supposed to do?" She steadied him for a moment, then placed a clawed hand on his chest. The warmth of her touch wasn't just physical, it radiated through him, a faint spark that tingled in his core. "You may not have my power," she said softly, "but you have courage. You freed me. You protected me when you had no reason to. That is enough." Before he could respond, she stepped to the pedestal, placing her hands on the Pyrian core. The light flared, filling the chamber with a blinding brilliance. Arden shielded his eyes, the heat growing unbearable. He thought he heard Lyria cry out a sound that was half a roar, half a scream. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the light faded. Lyria stood motionless, her wings spread wide, the light of the Pyrian core now flowing through her scales. When she turned to face him, her eyes glowed brighter than before, and her entire body seemed to hum with energy. "It worked," she said, her voice resonating deeper, layered with an almost musical undertone. "I feel it again. The flame. It's alive in me." Arden let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "So that's it? You're back to full power?" "Almost," Lyria said. "But there's one last thing. Something I must give you." Before he could ask what she meant, she stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. She placed both hands on his chest, and the warmth that had been a faint spark earlier now roared into a blazing heat. Arden gasped, but the fire wasn't painful. It flowed through him, lighting up every nerve, filling him with a surge of strength he couldn't describe. "What are you, he managed to say, his voice tight. "Sharing my flame," Lyria said. "Just a spark, to bind us. It will protect you, strengthen you. With it, you'll be able to stand against what's to come." As quickly as it had started, the connection ended. Lyria stepped back, and Arden fell to his knees, gasping. He looked at his hands, half expecting them to be on fire, but there was no visible change. Still, he felt it something deep within him, a faint, pulsing warmth that hadn't been there before. "What did you just do to me?" he asked, his voice shaky. Lyria's expression was serious. "I gave you a part of my essence. It's a great risk, but one I believe is worth taking. With it, you can help me fight what's coming." "What's coming?" Arden echoed. As if in answer, a deep, rumbling sound echoed through the temple. Arden turned toward the entrance just in time to see a red light flashing through the golden mist. The hunters had found them. And this time, they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Lyria's eyes blazed. "We stand together now, Arden. The fight has only just begun."